Hi everyone, welcome back to the channel. Tabletop RPGs such as Dungeons & Dragons and Pathfinder are a great way to escape the stressful and mundane fact of day-to-day life, and just unwind and have fun making a fantasy story with you and your friends. Though sometimes some people can bring that stress to the table and take it out on other players. Oftentimes that can lead to a result that they may not like. Much like the theme in this D&D horror story. If you like what I do here, I ask that you please like, comment, and subscribe to appease the algorithm gods and help my channel grow. Anyway, with that said, let's get right into the story. The Succubus Priestess, a tale of promiscuity, nonsensical preaching, and complete illiteracy, by Reddit user The Singularity Floof. Hi folks, long-time lurker, first-time poster, all that good stuff. I'm here to share the story of a problematic player who was an unfortunate part of my gaming group for several months. They have since departed, but this sub and a healthy dose of crit crab, and hopefully now a doge. I'm softer and don't pinch. Has inspired me to share the tale of our mistakes in hopes that lessons may be learned. A lot of this story's problems stem from my own mistakes and overlooking gigantic red flags, frankly. This story is quite long, so there will be a TLDR at the end for those interested. Without further ado, background. This story makes more sense with some context to back it up. At the start of this story, I had recently been getting acquainted with a new friend group after meeting my boyfriend. We met through an MMO and I joined up with his guild. It's a relatively small group, 15 to 20 active members, of pretty tight-knit friends, and we have a Discord server where we hang out and play games together. As it turned out, a number of other people in the Discord were into tabletop games, and after getting to know them for a bit, I offered to run a Pathfinder game for some of them. At the time, I still didn't know most of the group super well, so I invited the people I got along well with, and started setting things up. I was pretty excited to be DMing again after nearly 2 years of being away from it, so I didn't vet people too carefully. That was a big mistake on my part. The cast. Me, a longtime GM and player who probably should have seen red flags a mile away. GMing Pathfinder with a fair bit of homebrew at the behest of 2 of the other players in the group. Priestess, the star of our tale, playing a tiefling cleric dedicated to a homebrew god of redemption. A first-timer with Pathfinder, but not with tabletop gaming as a whole. A friend of the group who seemed kind of awkward, but generally okay at first. Fox, one of the 2 players who initially convinced me to DM a game for the group. An experienced player playing a Kitsune Samurai Lord. Fox's knowledge of the system was incredible, which will come up as we move on. Wolf, the second of our experienced players, playing Fox's retainer. A Rakshasa blooded tiefling samurai. He GMs a Star Wars tabletop game for the same server. Probably the most easygoing, relaxed person I know. Yet even his patience was tested by Priestess. Raven, my boyfriend, a newcomer to Pathfinder playing a Dhampir summoner. He was pretty quick to pick things up, despite being unfamiliar with the system. Phoenix, a friend of my boyfriend's, new to Pathfinder but not tabletop, playing a Samsaran cleric at first, later switches to an Ifrit sorcerer. Bones, a mutual friend of the group who joined a bit into the campaign, playing a Tabaxi, homebrew conversion from 5e, Witch. Part 1. The Early Days. The first signs of disaster began before we even started playing. I had decided to run a politics-heavy game focused on kingdom building and intrigue. Think Kingmaker mixed with Game of Thrones. Set in a northern country where the king had recently perished with no legitimate heir. The players were on board with the idea, and we got together to make characters and talk shop. Fox and Wolf both bought into the premise heavily and rolled up a pair of samurai, a young lord and his retainer, from a far-off land, come to make their fortune in the volatile lands of the north. Raven decided to play the scion of one of the noble houses in the area, striking off on her own to prove herself. Phoenix chose to play a cleric of the magic goddess, useful in both adventuring and advising capacities. All in all, they fit in nicely, and I was pretty happy with how their characters turned out. Priestess was another story. Their initial character concept was fantastic. An elven bard who was the princess in exile of a neighboring kingdom. The backstory was a little cliche, but it was ripe with political intrigue, and fit well with the theme of a group of young, ambitious people trying to make it big in the kingdom's power vacuum. So I was all for it. Yet, it wasn't to be. A few days before we started, Priestess approached me wanting to change their character. We hadn't started yet, so I figured, sure, why not? Their next concept was a tiefling cleric, a priestess to one of the local gods and a local figure for the game's starting town. It struck me as a little odd, since they didn't have a hook to the intrigue side of the game, but I figured they just wanted to lean into a supportive adventuring role. The character was also very similar to the PC they had played in Wolf's Star Wars campaign, but with more fantasy flavor. I brushed it off as them wanting to get used to the system within their comfort zone and help them make a new sheet. However, one thing became apparent as we went. They were dead set on having the half-succubus template instead of the usual tiefling race. Now, I'm no stranger to odd character builds. I don't usually shy away from weird ideas, and I'm happy making them work, as long as the table was fine with it. I had also done some homebrew stuff with the other players. Fox and Wolf ran a duo build revolving around Fox shape-changing into a giant fox that Wolf rode into battle, so I was on board with helping Priestess do something unusual. We eventually settled on a solution, allowing him to use the template bonuses in place of point-buy stats, as they ended up close in value. But I probably should have taken this as a sign of things to come, given their odd obsession with the template. This was not the only peculiar thing about Priestess's character creation. The other players had all come to the table with relatively focused backstories. Each was concise, but gave them clear motivations and left some room to play with using the backstories for plot hooks. Priestess, on the other hand, offered a few vague sentences about redeeming her past and struggling with her inner demons, before writing up page after page of backstory about her parents, neither of whom was alive or relevant to the story. As far as I can tell, the backstory never was finished, and to this day, I couldn't tell you how any of it relates to Priestess. The first session rolls around and things go pretty well. The party meets up on the roads, sheltering together from a heavy storm, before deciding to travel together to Priestess's home village. Along the way, there was plenty of roleplay and an introductory combat with an owlbear. I was very pleased with how things went, and since the players expressed a desire to continue roleplaying after the session, I made a secondary Discord where they could roleplay and chat about the game. Smooth sailing so far, I thought. Part 2. Roll to Proselytize. Our Priestess problem started to rear its head in the second session. The group busied themselves doing favors for the town to gain an audience with the local lord, as low-level adventurers are wont to do. However, I began to notice a pattern. Priestess would only really do two things. The first was to make lewd jokes. Now, this normally isn't a huge problem. Everyone at the table is an adult, have similar senses of humor, and generally don't mind an occasional raunchy joke. However, it quickly became apparent that Priestess would turn this into 90% of their character dialogue with the justification of being a half-succubus. On top of the jokes, they also played their character as extremely promiscuous, which was uncomfortable, to say the least, especially considering the player in question was a grown man in his mid-20s. By the end of the second session, it had gotten very old, very quickly. I told them to tone it back after the session, and they agreed. The other thing Priestess would do was preach. Specifically, extremely aggressive preach their god's will at everyone and everything that might potentially have ears. At first, it was mostly the villagers, which made sense given that Priestess was their local cleric. It stopped making sense when she tried to preach at a rampaging troll. The party, all of whom were openly followers of other deities or had other cultural beliefs, and virtually every other living being she came into contact with. Even more bizarrely, Priestess didn't entirely seem to know what she was preaching about. Prior to the session, the player had asked for details about his character's god, and asked that they be a lawful good deity that fit their character themes. No problem, I thought. I wrote up a few paragraphs of lore for a deity whose faith focused on personal growth and redemption. with the intent for them to be a very accepting, open-minded faith that could fit with Priestess's internal struggles. The only thing they truly would not tolerate was an evildoer with zero remorse. As far as I could tell, redemption is the only word Priestess actually read. Her usual routine usually involved telling everyone that they met that they must confess to her, heavily implied to be sexual at nearly every opportunity Priestess found, and atone for their sins, regardless of whether or not they had actually done anything wrong. Priestess also made a point that any way of atoning other than her word specifically was wrong and would be punished. Strangely, Priestess never did follow up on that, nor did she ever seem willing to fight anything at all. After a few sessions of the absolutely nonsensical attempts to convert and or have sex with anything capable of locomotion, I was starting to get wary of Priestess. The other players didn't seem bothered, as Priestess was a pretty quiet player. While their interactions could be grating, they were few and far between, and Priestess seemed like they were well-meaning, just kind of awkward and weird. And the strange behavior never came up when we hung out outside of session. This continued for a few months of play, with things going mostly great save for an occasional moment where Priestess said or did something awkward that left the table uncomfortable. This all changed around the 6-month mark. By this point, the game had developed a great deal. Bones had joined up as the party's 6th member. The party had acquired a small border fort, and were now moving up the ranks of nobility. The party was moving in to assess their new property and clear it of a long-standing haunting, when the first major incident occurred. Part 3. I rolled diplomacy on the corpse. Around halfway into the session, the party found a secret laboratory in the cellar of their new fort. I went into detail describing it, as well as the big oddity in the room, a long dead corpse of a massive ancient construct. The party was quick to investigate, including Priestess. Most of the party went for sensible lines of investigating, such as knowledge checks, searching the room, etc. Priestess then decides, spontaneously, that perhaps praying near the creature will awaken it. I shrugged to myself and described that she prays beside it, but it does not react in any way. After all, it is a corpse. Notably, this was not the first time she had tried this, as earlier in the session she had tried to proselytize at every zombie to very little success. Priestess, unsatisfied, attempts no less than 4 diplomacy checks to convince a corpse to wake up. At this point, I'm confused, but try to gently point out that the corpse is, well, dead, and cannot be reasoned with via diplomacy. This frustrates Priestess, seemingly, and she continues to attempt to prompt a reaction out of it via preaching, last rites, and other religious measures. At this point, it's been a solid 20 minutes of this nonsensical line of thought, and the rest of the party is both frustrated by these antics and ready to move on, as they were unable to uncover clues. They had decided to ask someone who might be familiar with constructs instead, so I try to push things onwards. Priestess, 2 more checks later, finally decides to let it go. But at this point, I can tell the party wants to call it, as Priestess had stalled for nearly a half hour, and the party's groove had very much been lost. We called the session shortly after clearing out the rest of the fort. A couple of the others remarked on the Priestess episode after the session, and we all agreed that maybe it was mechanics confusion. Priestess had struggled a bit with combat and other mechanics in Pathfinder, so we thought that maybe the player didn't really entirely understand how diplomacy worked. Fox and I talked to him afterwards and tried to explain that, in general, diplomacy doesn't work very well against dead things or creatures incapable of rational thought. Additionally, we tried to explain that, while a high diplomacy roll helps, it still won't let you do the impossible or convince something of a totally irrational argument. This concept never seemed to root itself entirely into Priestess's mind, as she tried to convert undead creatures with diplomacy on other occasions. Part 4. The Paranoid Breakdown. The diplomacy incident was shortly followed by the strangest change I have ever witnessed in an individual. Priestess, outside of session, had always been a pretty chill person. He seemed kind of clueless and a bit weird, but otherwise pretty pleasant and well-meaning. This changed basically overnight. I make a point of keeping out-of-game drama far from the table, But Priestess had no such qualms. For context, the MMO group we were part of had been growing rapidly, and eventually split based on different opinions on how an MMO guild should be run. Priestess was friends with a person who wanted to split their group of friends off and do their own thing, but that person left them out of the decision. Priestess, understandably, was pretty upset. Unfortunately, at virtually the same time, the remaining members finalized our roster for the new raids that had just come out, and Priestess was not on it. This further agitated him, as quickly became apparent. Although we'd simply picked someone else based on being a better fit for the roster. Given how MMO drama, friends being shitty people, and being excluded by people you care about all suck, we all tried to be supportive of Priestess whenever we hung out or had a session. However, Priestess began acting unimaginably paranoid. He became extremely quick to accuse people of acting behind his back, trying to exclude him from activities, or bad-mouthing him. At first, we figured this kind of behavior was just an awkward guy trying to cope with shitty circumstances. We consoled him as much as we could and hoped it'd blow over. After all, Priestess had been an otherwise pretty nice guy before all this. Maybe it was just a rough patch. Spoiler alert, it definitely wasn't. Part 5. Public Indecency and Other Highlights. Over the next few months, Priestess became steadily more frustrating to deal with. The previous annoyances with their character had become more pronounced, and their out-of-character behavior was getting worse. Despite our attempts to be comforting and help him through his issues, he continued to lash out, give an empty apology, and then lash out again. This led to a long list of incidents over the next few months of the campaign. In an effort to keep this story from being ludicrously long, I'll just include some of the highlights. These include complaining on multiple occasions that his character was useless or didn't do anything in combat. Fox and I tried to explain on many occasions that clerics are a typically supportive class and showed him some spells that might help. We also suggested helping him rework his character to a class he might like better and fit his character stats more. Priestess, pointedly, did not take any of those suggestions. Priestess's anxiety over being useful in combat apparently was strong enough to cause him to lash out at other players for doing their jobs. On multiple occasions, he complained that Fox's samurai didn't do too much damage, and at one point grew despondent and huffy over Phoenix healing the party in combat. Priestess would categorically refuse to look anything up himself. Despite the whole party's numerous attempts to help teach him the system, Priestess refused to spend any time reading the Pathfinder wiki or searching up easily found answers to some of his questions, even after we showed him the resources. Priestess would also constantly complain that we never helped him even though we sat down and walked him through everything. On multiple occasions, Priestess left the session with no explanation. During the climatic dungeon crawl of the biggest arc of the campaign, he disappeared for an entire session without a word. Priestess had a habit of making enemies in character, then whining that nobody liked Priestess very much. Some notable incidents include incinerating Bones' undead familiar after being warned that channeling positive energy to hurt undead would kill them, then refusing to admit it and trying to blame Phoenix instead. Repeatedly trying to antagonize Fox's character over the death of Wolf's first character, blaming him for everything that went wrong, and accusing him of being an awful person who ignored the common folk, while he was helping those same common folk. The reasoning? Fox's character would not sleep with Priestess. Approaching Raven's character after she had lost her title in an attempt to gaslight her into believing Priestess was the only one she could trust, despite trying to manipulate her constantly. Between sessions, the party would often post in the roleplay server. Priestess thought it would be a brilliant idea to post a 3-paragraph description of how they were, quote, succumbing to their urges, and, quote, needing someone right that instant. It was borderline erotic roleplay in the public chat of a server where everything else had been kept PG-13. Needless to say, the post was taken down, and I informed Priestess that sort of content was very inappropriate for the roleplay chat. It didn't happen again, but I suspect from his responses he never understood why that wasn't cool, especially unsolicited. Needless to say, between the increasing paranoia, in and out of game misbehavior, and the uncomfortable roleplay, the whole group was getting very tired of dealing with Priestess. We had tried our best to be accommodating during a rough patch, but almost 4 months later, nothing was improving. At this point, the sole reason I kept them around was fear that it would cause drama to bleed into the larger group. Something had to give. Part 6. The Crusade. As we concluded the second major arc of the campaign, I decided it would be a good time to try and talk to everyone privately, and have a talk about what was going well with the campaign and what wasn't. The group agreed that Priestess was an issue and things were starting to get tense with the continued behavior both in and out of session. I decided at that point that I was going to give Priestess one more chance. I took him aside between sessions and laid out the party's issues in plain English. I told him that the constant complaining and paranoia were frustrating, that the in-character issues were causing parts of the party to stop wanting to play, and that I wanted to give him a couple weeks to work on it together. Otherwise, I'd need to ask him to leave the game. Surprisingly, he took it decently well and agreed. I tried to help him with his character again, without much success. I suggested some good spells and some class changes, and even some homebrew options. He instead demanded that I make an entirely new class to fit his preferences. And the issues continued. He continued to start trouble with his character, and continued to complain during combat. I finally gave up when he DM'd me mid-roleplay session to complain that, quote, no one liked his character. And when I explained why people found Priestess frustrating, I was told that I was, quote, telling him he couldn't play her the way he wanted. The following night, I put my foot down and asked him to leave. He did not take that well and promptly demanded that I find him a new campaign before I could ask him to leave this one. As one might expect, I did not do that. I told him something I should have months before. He needed to learn to do some things on his own. I wasn't happy to kick him from the campaign, but we'd all had enough. Priestess immediately went on what the group has since dubbed the Crusade, prodding every single member of the group and trying to get them to say exactly who wanted him gone and why they hated him, complaining that I was an unfair DM and didn't have the right to kick him from the group, and trying to get them to allow him back in. Nobody bit the bullet, but it was even enough to finally snap Wolf's patience, who had been the only member of the group who wanted to give him another chance. Epilogue. It's been a few months since Priestess left the game. Surprisingly, he's still kicking around the MMO Discord due to being friends with a few of the admins. We haven't talked much beyond a few awkward interactions since then. Our game, meanwhile, is still going strong, and we've been having a blast. We've invited a new player who's been great fun, and the game is better all around. Still, I end up thinking about Priestess a fair bit. I honestly feel pretty bad for him, as losing your place at an RPG table really sucks. But there's only so much people can take. I wish I could have done things better and nipped the issues in the bud much sooner. But you live and you learn. TLDR, player plays an obnoxious succubus priestess who tries to have sex with and convert everything in sight, brings out-of-game drama to the table, and demands that we find him a new game once finally given the boot. It definitely sounds like the player playing the priestess was dealing with some out-of-game drama, and even seems like the rest of the party tried to be nice and console him. But to take out your frustrations on other people that have nothing to do with it is never a good way to cope with anything. Also, to try and force adult RP with other players without considering how they feel about it is just creepy, and seems to be the theme in a lot of these D&D horror stories, unfortunately. Anyways, I would like to thank you for sticking around for the whole video, as it was a bit on the longer side. If you have a story that you would like to see featured on the channel, you can always go post it in the subreddit r/DNDdoge, or even just at me on Twitter. As always, I appreciate all of you, and may all your rolls be natural 20. Take care.